Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Resilient Rehab Podcast. I'm your host, Alex Effer, and today we're going to be talking about pelvic floor. We're talking about some misconceptions behind pelvic floor, and more specifically about some of the exercises that are typically given that aren't the most effective, and how we can have a different approach on pelvic floor and understanding how we can use it in a more dynamic way and how it relates to all movement. At the end of the day, we're all working on the pelvic floor. There seems to be this misconception that unless you're directly working on the pelvic floor, you're not actually using it. The pelvic floor is just another diaphragm. So we've got a thoracic diaphragm that's going to integrate with our pelvic diaphragm. And both of those diaphragms are going to be associated with manipulating the pressure within our body. So everyone's probably heard about the intra-abdominal pressure, but if you haven't, when you take a big breath in and you brace, the intention of that, especially when you're lifting heavy weight, is to increase pressure in your abdomen. So when you inhale, especially if you hold your breath, that's going to, at the end of the inhale, that's going to create more of this pressure within your stomach. This intra-abdominal pressure is going to push the internal organs down into the pelvic floor, and that's going to cause the pelvic floor to basically catch those organs or those guts. So when I inhale, the thoracic diaphragm pushes things down, the pelvic diaphragm catches it. Then when I exhale, the pelvic diaphragm now is going to contract. It's going to throw those pelvic floor up towards the thoracic diaphragm, and now the thoracic diaphragm is more curved, so it catches. And so it's this constant catching back and forth between this thoracic diaphragm and the pelvic floor. And why that's important is because the pelvic floor is really integrated into breathing, managing pressure, and it's also going to be associated with the changing of the shape of the rib cage and the pelvis. And so when we're thinking about movement, it's very dynamic. It's important to understand that the pelvic floor is not this uniform movement. So I just described it from a symmetrical standpoint, but it's associated to managing the pressure and the force even coming from the ground. So when I take a step forward, I'm going to have a turning or a twisting of my pelvis. And that twisting of the pelvis is going to create a different contraction of the pelvic floor depending on what foot hits the ground. So if I'm striking the ground with the right foot, for example, then I'm going to have more of this pelvic floor that's going to be descended. And on the left side, because I'm pushing off that side, I'm going to have more of a contracted, ascended pelvic floor. Now, we could go further into dividing the pelvic floor into two different sections, but we're going to leave that for now. I talk about this so much in my Evolve Biomechanics mentorship because it is really important when it comes to exercise selection and programming. But just for now, just think as I put pressure into the ground or as I'm accepting force, absorbing force, that pelvic floor should be a little bit more descended. When I'm producing force, the pelvic floor should be more contracted because I'm trying to pressurize the pelvis to shoot those organs back up because I need to create force into the ground. As I'm descending into a squat, the pelvic floor should be descending. As I'm coming up from the bottom and putting force into the ground to stand up, the pelvic floor should be ascending. And so you can just see how as I go down, organs get pushed down. As I go up, the organs get pushed up. And so there's this dynamic interplay between, as I said, the thoracic diaphragm and the pelvic floor. What common exercises get prescribed are something like Kegels. And that's really just like, think about squeezing your butt and consciously or thinking about it, trying to lift the pelvic floor. The problem is try doing a Kegel as you're walking. It's not possible because you got this rotation going through your pelvis. Additionally, it's not integrated. The Kegel is not integrated with your thoracic diaphragm. So despite the fact that we may be thinking that there are specific pelvic floor exercises, which there are, don't get me wrong, it's important to understand that every time we're doing something like a squat, a split squat, we are doing a press variation depending on the position. So it can be decline, flat, or incline, depending on the position. That's going to influence things a bit differently. Hinging, rowing, everything is going to influence the pelvic floor. So when we're looking at somebody and we're trying to program for them, it's important to understand that every exercise we do is a pelvic floor exercise. We can also understand that the pelvic floor, because if we're putting force into the ground, that is resulting in the pelvic floor lifting up. That lifting up of the pelvic floor is going to open up the bottom part of the pelvis, or the outlet. And so if you see the video aspect of this podcast, you'll see what I'm doing with the pelvis. And so the pelvic floor is attached to the bottom of the sit bones. And so if the sit bones come closer together, more associated with this externally rotated pelvis and a descending of the pelvic floor, well, that pelvic floor is going to sag down like a hammock, which is very important, again, for when I want to accept force, when I want to decelerate, when I want to go into hip flexion exercises or just hip flexion movements. But then when I ascend, or when I put force into the ground, now these sit bones start to move away from each other because the pelvis internally rotates. And so if the pelvis internally rotates, now these 2 points attaching to either part of the sit bone, they're going to be pulled apart, and that's going to cause tension through the pelvic floor to lift it up. And again, the pelvic floor is also attached to the coccyx, and so that's going to also have an influence. So when I internally rotate the pelvis and I lift the pelvic floor, this sacrum is going to go backwards, called nutation, and that's going to further create tension through it. And that's going to further change the shape of the pelvic floor. Like I said, we can divide the pelvic floor into front and back, side to side, right? We can do it into different quadrants. And that's going to be really important for when it comes to rotation and when it comes to one foot being in front of the other. But from this perspective, we're talking about things in a symmetrical manner, just to make it a little bit simpler. So that sacrum is going to nutate. And then if I am opening the pelvis up, causing the pelvic floor to descend, then that's going to cause a counter nutation, or the tailbone being tucked underneath. That's going to be important for hip flexion. And so when we're thinking, again, about the pelvic floor, it's important to understand that it is a pressure regulator. So when my foot hits the ground, I need to be able to put that foot in front of me just to be able to accept that force. But if I'm hitting the ground with too much stiffness, that pelvic floor is not able to relax and descend. Well, then I'm going to be hitting the ground with more of a straight leg. I'm going to be arching my back, hyperextending my knee, doing these different compensations because my body, or my pelvis and my pelvic floor and my legs, are not able to yield and accept that force. And then when I want to produce the force and now I want to contract and pressurize the pelvis, if I can't do that, similar things may happen. I may arch my back, I may flare my ribs, I may round my shoulder forward because I'm not able to do that myself. I'm not able to propel my center of mass forward. And so now I'm going to be doing things that are compensatory just to be able to create enough pressure to push me forward. So doing something like a Kegel may not be the most effective. For some people, sitting down, creating this internal connection, that's important. Absolutely. Especially if we're thinking about, can we integrate it with breathing? So when I inhale, think about the pelvic floor going down, think about the thoracic diaphragm going down, think about your pelvic floor being pushed into the seat. When I exhale, think about the pelvic floor being lifted up. Those are very effective cues, but again, that is integrated. It is not just squeeze your glutes, because oftentimes a lot of people who have pelvic floor issues, they already have really tense glutes. They already have the center of gravity is really far forward. And all you're doing is just getting them to push forward more and more. And that's going to lead to a further inability to use the pelvic floor. So when we're looking, so another aspect of this is assessment. So again, as I said, an ascending of the pelvic floor, that's going to be related to the pelvis at the bottom opening up and closing at the top. Think about taking a belt and tying it really tight. That's essentially what's happening. And so that is going to be associated with internal rotation of the hip. Conversely, if we're thinking about external rotation, we're thinking about this pelvic floor descending. Well, that's going to be the external rotation of the hip. That's going to be related to hip flexion. And so I can start to use my assessment measurements to determine the shape of the pelvis and therefore what the associated pelvic floor position is. I hope this kind of gives you an idea that pelvic floor is an important aspect to consider as it relates to the whole body movement. It's not just an isolated muscle, right? We're not trying to isolate the pelvic floor, but we're trying to coordinate it back with proper respiration, proper pressure management, and range of motion through the joints, using squats, using lunges, split squats, deadlifts, rows, presses, any kind of movement. As long as we put the body in a position to allow for the pelvic floor to work dynamically with everything else, then we're going to be training it. So thank you so much for listening. Don't forget to like, save, and subscribe. Share with somebody who may find this helpful. And I look forward to seeing you next time. Keep moving.